Hello, everyone. I'm Eric D'Souza, and joining me today is the author Greg Rhyno. Hi, Greg. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good too. So, we are continuing the tradition of speaking to Crime Writers of Canada members who have been shortlisted for the Awards of Excellence. Greg's book, Who by Fire, has been nominated for the Best Crime Novel Set in Canada, sponsored by Shaftesbury with a $500 prize. A little bit about Greg. He's an author of the Dame Polara Mysteries series, published by Cormorant Books, including Who by Fire, which we will be discussing today. His debut novel, To Me You Seem Giant, it was published by New West Press, was nominated for a ReLit Award and an Alberta Book Publishing Award. He completed his MFA at the University of Guelph and lives with his family in Guelph, Ontario. So you're in the category of novel set in Canada.
Mhm.
I can tell you that three other Crime Writers of Canada members are also, or two others are also in the category with you. So 60% of you. I've read
Okay.
the beginning of all your books, and it's more than just by coincidence it's in Canada. There's a very strong sense of Canada. And maybe you cheated a little bit with your title because I read Who by Fire and I was like, where do I know that from? And I didn't Google it, but I was reading your book, and then you mentioned Leonard Cohen, very Canadian, and I was like, that's where I know it from. So, what came first? Like, did you write the book and then come up with, oh, very Canadian, Who by Fire? Or else did you come up with your title?
I went through a few title changes for that one, but and that's like eventually I landed on Who by Fire. Um, but my first book too is a Canadian song lyric. To Me You Seem Giant is a lyric from a song called Pen Pals by Sloan. And my background is I was always interested in writing, but a lot of my background is in playing music and playing in bands around Canada. And so that is one of my first great loves. And I really did, I love the idea of sort of bringing in Canadian elements into a story, not just for the purposes of being nominated for an awesome award, but it feels, I really like regionalism. Like I sort of, I like Canadian TV shows. I'm interested in Canadian pop culture, and I really I brought that into my first book. And when I decided to write a crime story, I wanted to bring that in as well. And it wasn't sort of intentional. It was fairly organic. And I think Canada is a really interesting place to write about, and it's not written about enough.
I got a very strong sense of Toronto in your book. And I'm from out east originally, and I used to visit Toronto like 40 years ago when it wasn't the city that it is now. It was very much businesslike and I don't know, almost bland. Can't say that
Mhm.
about Toronto anymore. Um, what to you, you kind of already started answering that question, but what to you makes Toronto so important and needs to be written
I,
about?
I have a funny relationship with Toronto just because I was born in Toronto, but I've never really lived there. I lived in Brampton, I lived in Thunder Bay, and I currently live in Guelph. And so I always feel like a little bit like a tourist when I go to Toronto. And it's always a place that's a little bit more exciting than the place that I live in. And like I said, when I was younger, I played music, and so a lot of times going to Toronto for me was sort of going like driving into the city to play a show at, the Horseshoe or the Silver Dollar and feeling like I had to sort of prove myself. And so there's a little bit of that going on, I think. But as I've sort of gotten older, I really like going to Toronto. I think there's a really interesting arts community there. I think it's really nice to live next to a city like Toronto where there's always something going on and always something exciting. Um, I've got some background where like my folks lived in Toronto, so I sort of it's sort of there's a lot of family history for me, hearing about my folks living there when they were younger, about my dad going to spend time there. He grew up in uh, partly in he spent I shouldn't say grew up. He spent some time in Parkdale, where the novel's set. And so I'd hear stories about Parkdale growing up and how it was kind of rough and tumble. And I know it has changed a lot too, but I sort of carried that with me into the novel.
Dame sort of has an interesting job that ties her to the city, which is interesting because it is a growing city, and her job, I don't know her specific department, but it's preserving heritage buildings is what she does. And it's an interesting position for her to be in because she is trying to hold on to the past
Mhm.
in a city that's growing super, super fast, right? It's one of the biggest cities in North America. Why did you give her this job?
Um, I, I, the first novel that I wrote, To Me You Seem Giant, was sort of uncritically nostalgic. It was really sort of look back on the past, particularly the '90s and the early aughts, with just real like rose-colored glasses. And we're kind of getting into a world right now where I think uncritical nostalgia is a little bit dangerous. That people who sort of blindly hold on to the past and think things were better back then and want to sort of make things great again, right? That is, I think I don't really like that. I think that's a little bit dangerous. So I wanted to have a character who was sort of, as I sometimes feel myself, is sort of stuck between the past and the present, and the future too. She's a character who, she is wants to preserve buildings, cares about the past a lot, but is really interested in moving forward, wants to leave behind certain parts of the past. And I think there is that idea of that sort of romantic idea of the detective is something that she grew up with. She's a character whose father was a detective, and she grew up sort of as his sidekick, and she wants to leave that world behind and move on. She doesn't see the glamour in that. She feels like she spent too much time, poking around in people's business, and she wants to leave that world behind and move forward. But ironically, one of the ways that she moves forward is by working at this job where she protects the past. So she's sort of caught up in both sides of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because at the beginning they're trying to preserve a theater, and I think because of red tape, the builder had to keep the facade of the building, but
Yeah,
was allowed to or is trying to gut the rest. And it's sort of a very interesting allegory, I guess, of
yeah,
Canada, of like of everything you're doing. Like I'm seeing the solid theme going through that book.
yeah,
Um, Her dad, who even she calls Dodge, uh,
yeah.
early on, we see what he's reading or what the books on his bookshelf. Raymond Chandler, Elmer Leonard, and Walter Mosley. Is that a sneak into your bookshelf?
A little bit like that. I think those are writers that I was reading while I was writing that novel. Um, but I think, we were talking about this a little bit before, just that I don't really have there's not one style of detective novel that I always sort of, tend to gravitate towards. Um, I do like the hard-boiled stuff. I do like Raymond Chandler. But I also really like kind of you would probably be better to define this category than I would be, but I always sort of refer to it as like weirdo detective fiction, and it's stuff like it's sort of meta detective stuff. Like I do I'm just looking at my bookshelf right now. I really like Bellevue Square by Michael Redhill. I think that's a great book. I like Inherent Vice by Thomas Pynchon. I like Jonathan Letham's detective stuff, and I think even Walter Mosley sort of does a lot of sort of self-aware detective fiction. So I think in terms of how I came into being interested in detective stories, it was really sort of through that, and like Paul Auster has these sort of the New York trilogy, just sort of very sort of weird meta narratives about the detective ultimately was just looking for themselves. And so I thought that was the kind of story I was going to read, or rather, that was the kind of story I was going to write. Um, and I just had so much fun playing with plot that it turned into something else entirely.
You know, I like the term that you just said, self-aware detective story.
Yeah.
I'm gonna borrow that one. I know it's on tape, but I'm gonna borrow that one. One of the reviews I read on your website, and you almost started to answer this question already, but Jeff Dupree from the Miramichi Reader said your book was Defying Genre Conventions, which I find very interesting for a new author to even try. Was it something that you were really conscious of? Like, I am going to break the rules, or did it just happen that way?
I think I wasn't really trying to be too subversive, but I was, I went into it thinking, okay, there's a few things I don't want to do. Um, like I don't like there's no guns in my story, for example. There's no guns in Who by Fire. The next novel coming out is Who by Water, and there's no guns in that. And I felt like that would be something that I just didn't want to have in the novel as sort of something to work around. It just seemed like a convenient plot device a lot of the time. Someone pulls out a gun. Um, and I was like, can I work without that? The other thing that's a little bit strange about Who by Fire is there isn't really a murder, right? It starts off as a story about a woman who basically has to take on a detective job to keep her apartment, right? And then it turns into this arson conspiracy, and there is death in it, but it's sort of not necessarily in the way that you expect. I can tell you that the second book, Who by Water, is a little more straightforward in terms of there is a mysterious drowning death, and it's a little bit more straightforward in terms of the investigation. But I sort of stumbled into that narrative, and so that's one of the ways I think I was trying sort of intentionally to be unconventional. I think the other part of it was just having a detective who was a very reluctant detective. That was important to me. I wanted a character who wasn't. I love watching cop shows, or shows where you have these people who are just obsessed with their jobs and who want to spend every moment of their day being a cop or being a detective or being a superhero or whatever it is. They're dedicated to this. But I wanted a character who was sort of like, yeah, I know I have to do this job, but I also would like to watch Netflix or go out for drinks with my friends, right? Like that. I wanted her to be a little bit more well-rounded and less obsessed with the job until she gets pulled into it because she has to.
Circling back to titles a little bit, and we'll end with this one. Who by Fire, the first line. Second line, Who by Water of
Yeah.
Leonard Cohen's song. Does that mean you're working on a third Who in the Night or Who in the Sunshine? Probably breaking
Yeah,
it.
I feel like Who in the Sunshine is maybe not mysterious enough, but but um, but yeah, I have a working title for the third book. That's what I'm working on right now, and it is another Who by, but I'm not going to tell you what it is right now. You'll have to wait for that one.
All right, that makes sense because there's a lot of who's in that
Yeah.
song, so you get to pick and choose. I was just curious if you're going to stick them in order.
Well, it's based on a liturgical poem, a Jewish liturgical poem, and it really sort of lists all these different ways that a person can die. And I thought that was a pretty interesting, that it felt just like built for a detective series.
Oh, and I think I wrote to you this, but I love the cover. I don't know how
Oh,
much
thank you.
I don't know how much was you or how much of that was Cormorant, but
It
cover is
was
beautiful.
there's a designer named Mariah Friesen, and she designed it, and she basically, that first cover, she basically showed that to me, and I loved it. It was great. There was a couple other covers that we were looking at, and I was like, I don't feel like this totally fits what I'm doing. And then she sent me that, and I'm like, yep, that's it. Perfect. Don't change it. So
Yeah, the two of
that's
you should
all.
submit those to cover design contests that they have, and you'd have solid shots, and then you could be a two-time winner for this novel.
I'm going to tell her that because it'll be a great
Yeah,
game.
kudos to her. Like I love the books that Cormorant puts out, and they keep on putting out great books.
Yeah, they are a good organization.
Great. Well, this was the first time you and I chatted, Greg. I'm hoping it's not the last. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.